Hi everyone, welcome to the second part of the Excel Pivot Primer. After I made the first video, I realized that the primer would be incomplete without spending some more time on some of the key useful critical features of using the pivot table. After all, it is these additional features that give Excel pivots the power and the capability to represent data so effectively. In this part, we'll cover the following topics. Shortcuts for generating the pivot. We already know we can generate the pivot by using the insert pivot table option. However, you can also generate the pivot using a shortcut. Selecting changing data range for pivot. So very often what you'll find is that you start off with an original pivot table, original data set, and then you create a pivot. And then later on, as the data evolves, you have to add additional columns, additional rows, or both maybe to the data table. So then we have to expand, or in some cases even reduce the range of the pivot that we are interested in. So we'll take a look at how we can custom select the range for the pivot that we're trying to construct. We dealt with calculated field a bit. We'll revise that. Calculated item, I don't think we took an example of this, so we'll take a look at a quick example of how to utilize the calculated item option within the Excel pivots. We'll also look at how do we look at expanding the data. So once you've created the pivot table structure, if you wanted to look at the expanded version of the data, how would you do that? Finally, we'll also take a look at the group function within the pivot table. It's a group function which gives us additional leverage when we try and categorize or bucketize the different items that you get by inserting the fields in the rows and the columns. Right, so without further ado, let's get cracking. What we'll do is, for the purpose of this exercise, we'll take a look at the raw data and take some simple examples so that we can understand what we're doing. So let's dive in. So the raw data table is what we used in the first primer video. There is an additional column which is days of work. The days of work is nothing but the days of effort that was required in order to generate the sales revenue by selling agricultural equipment for each of these line items. So for example, if you take a look at the first line that you have here, the first line item that you have here, what this means is that in order to generate the sales revenue by selling a harvest in the state of Alabama in the month of Jan, it took about 15 days of work, 15 days of effort to actually convert that sale finally into revenue of $19,000. That's what the days of work means. All right, so let's begin with generating the pivot. So in order to generate the pivot, the first step is let's go ahead and let's select the data. So let's say we select the data till column G, cost of sale, and scroll down all the way till the bottom so that you have the right data set selected. At this point, instead of clicking on insert and inserting the pivot table, all that we have to do in this case is if you hold down the Alt key on your keyboard and the key D as in David, Alt plus D on the keyboard. So just hold them down once and let go of the keys. And then once you've done that, if you just hit the key P as in Paul on the keyboard, it'll give you the pivot table and pivot chart wizard. Now on this pop-up, what you have to select is where is the data that you want to analyze. Now remember that when we chose the option for insert pivot table, there were two options in there. One was that you already have localized Excel data. The other option was an external source. In this case, we're going to limit ourselves to the Microsoft Excel list or database option. And the second thing that it asks for is what kind of report do you want to create. So the report that we want to create is right now the pivot table, not the pivot chart report. So let it be selected as pivot table. Let's go ahead and click next on this. Once you click next on the next option, it gives you the range. So for now, we are satisfied with the range that we have. So no changes required here. Let's click on next. Once you click on next, it asks you the question of where do you want to put the pivot table. So you can either put it on a new worksheet or you can put it on the existing worksheet as well. So let's go ahead and put it on the new worksheet for now. And let's click on finish. The moment you click on finish, you will see it has created an additional worksheet called sheet 2. On the sheet 2, it gives you the blank pivot table construct on the left hand side. On the right hand side, it gives you the pivot table fields for selection. So again, if you just go ahead and select any of these options from here, let's say we selected state, put it in rows. As you can see, each distinct item from the state column has been listed here. That's the distinct number of states. And let's say the sale revenue or the sales revenue is placed here. We know that when you do that, the aggregation function that applies by default is sum, because sale revenue or sales revenue is in effect a numeric field. So the default will be sum. So we've just taken a look at how we will go about creating a pivot table by using the shortcut options. So again, let's try it again and let's see how it works. So let's select the right data range. Once we have selected it, you press down Alt and D together and then leave it, and then press the letter P, P as in Paul, P as in Peter. Once you've done that, you get these options. Again, click on next on this one. So let's click on next, and the range is fine, so we'll let it be. And here now it says that your new report will use less memory if you base it on your existing report pivot table 2, which was created. So what's trying to tell us is that if we choose the option of yes, then the new pivot table that we'll create is going to be in effect using the same memory that our first pivot table is using. If we select no, it will allocate separate memory for the second pivot table that we're creating right now. So for now, let's say we select the option as no, and now it says new worksheet or existing worksheet. In this case, let's choose existing worksheet. Now, once you choose the existing worksheet, you have the capability to create the pivot table on any of the existing worksheets that you currently have. So let's say, for argument's sake, let's say we want to create the pivot table on the same worksheet that we are on, which is raw data. Okay, so let's go ahead, scroll to the right, and this looks like empty space right here. So if I click here and click on next, it then gives us the pivot construct on this very sheet. So by this feature, the Excel pivots give you the capability to put the pivot table wherever you want. If you want on a new sheet, you can have that option, or you can use an existing sheet as well. So again, if I just select, let's say city out here, and if you were to select sale revenue or sales revenue as the aggregating field, then you can see that it's now generated another pivot table on this sheet. All right. So now moving on to selection of different ranges. Okay, so let's delete this for now. So, all right. So what is the range of this pivot table? So if you want to check the range of an existing pivot table, whether it's this one or on any other pivot table on any other Excel sheet, how would you go about doing that? Now remember, we looked at the shortcut of Alt-D-P in order to generate the pivot. The good part about that shortcut is it will also allow you to take a look at the range. So if you click anywhere on the pivot, and then if you do an Alt-D-P on this, then you see that it talks about the pivot range right here, right? So you've gotten the pivot table and the pivot chart wizard again, and look at where it's starting off. It's starting off at step 3 of 3. Now ideally, if you were to launch this wizard on raw data, you wouldn't start off with step 3 of 3. You'd probably start off with step 1 of 3 and then progress to step 2 of 3 and so on. So this is starting off with step 3 of 3. If you click on the back button right here, okay, as you can see, now it shows you the data range that was selected for generating that pivot. And right now it says that the data range starts from, on the top left hand side, it starts from cell number A1, which is the field name, and goes all the way down to the bottom of column G, cost of sale. That's cell number G101. So this is how you can quickly and easily look up the range of the existing pivot table. All right, let's cancel out of this. That should take us back to the pivot. Perfect. So now, as you've seen, that this pivot that you're looking at right now, the pivot table that you're looking at right now, it extends all the way from name till column G, cost of sale. What if we wanted to extend the pivot table all the way till column I instead of column G? How would that occur? So the way that would occur is if you go back to the same pivot table or pivot chart wizard that we looked at, you will start off on step 3 of 3. You will click on back. It will give you the range. When you get to the range screen, all we have to do is make sure we select the new range that we want. So let's see how that would function. So let's go ahead and generate the pivot wizard again. As you can see, step 3 of 3, we click on back. It takes us to the range. Now what we can do is just click on name and select the new range that you'd want. So now I'm dragging the range all the way till column I and selecting all the way till the bottom of the raw data set. Now you can see the new range has been extended from G101 till I101. If you click on next and you click on finish, there we are. And now right click on this pivot and you can just click on refresh. Once you've done that, if you click on the pivot and go to the show field list. Remember, the show field list will take us back to the screen where we have the pivot table fields. Now if you scroll down and see the list of available fields, you will see that the number of calls and the days of work, these two fields, which were not there earlier on in our data range and as a consequence were not there as a part of the pivot structure, these have now been added to our list of options that we can select from. So that's how you can extend the range of the pivot. Needless to say, if you need to reduce the range of the pivot for some reason, you could do that following the same instructions or the same method as we see right now. All right. So let's close this and let's delete this sheet for now. We'll create a new one. Okay. What else? So let's take a look at the calculated field. So we already looked at the calculated field in the last video, but let's take a look at it again. Let's say the problem that we're trying to solve is we want to find out the sales revenue per day. In other words, what is the average revenue per day of work? How would that look like and what does it really mean? So for instance, for the first line item that you have here, you have sales revenue is $19,000 and the number of days of work is 15. So basically the average revenue per day of work will be nothing but the 19,000 divided by the 15. So around 1266.67 would be the average revenue per day of work. For the second line item, it will again be $2,833.33 for the average revenue per day of work, for example. So this is what we want. The only difference is we don't want it manually. We want it done through an existing pivot feature. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's select the data range first and generate the pivot. And again, select next. Let's select a new worksheet. And there we are. We have the new worksheet. Okay. Let's say we put state here and we put revenue here. All right. And also, just so that we can compare and understand this better, let's put the days of work in the values as well. So now you can see that in this case, it's again one-dimensional because your key variable or key field in this case is still state. You've just entered one field or one variable in state, but you are aggregating two different variables. You're aggregating sales or sales revenue and you're aggregating days of work. Make a note, both of these are numeric. As a result, your default value is that of sum. So let's understand how this would work. In order to calculate this, what we will do is we will generate a calculated field. How do we generate a calculated field? Once you click on the pivot and your selections on the pivot, at the top you should see an option, pivot table analyze. If you click on that, it gives you the option for fields, items and sets. So let's say we go to field, items and sets, we click on calculated field, and let's say that the field that we are interested in, let's give it a name. Let's call it sales per day. That's a new field that we have come up with. And what should be the formula? The formula for this will be the sales revenue divided by the days of work. And there we are. And let's click on OK. All right. So now what you have here is an additional variable which has now appeared. This is an artificial custom created variable or a custom created field, which is sales per day, as you can see. And again, it's got a lot of decimal places, so let's quickly fix that. Remember, in order to adjust the decimal places, if you just do a left click on the field for which you're trying to adjust the decimal places, just click on that, go to value field settings, and once you go to the value field settings out here, you see there's something called number format at the bottom left. Click on that number format, go to number, and from here you can adjust. So let's say if I select 3 decimal places, what happens? If you select 3 decimal places on this one, for example, you see on the days of work you get 3 decimal places, right? Let's go back and let's select 2 decimal places here. All right, there we are. Now let's fix the reason that brought us to the screen, which was to fix the decimal places for sales per day. So scroll down a bit, you have the sales per day. Let's go to value field settings, go to number format, click on number. It's by default, it'll show up as 2. Leave it the way it is, click on OK. Click on OK again, and there you can see now we have a manageable number of points beyond the decimal on the right. All right, so this is an example of how a calculated field would work. Now let's try and see if we can validate this information and make sure that what you have on the screen is correct, essentially. So what do these numbers mean? So the number 1390.15 ideally should be this sale revenue right here divided by 132. That's going to give us the sale per day on this, right? So how would this kind of work? The way it should work is, if I was to divide this number by this number, then it should give me 1390.15, right? All right, let's see. Okay, you can see that the answer is correct. So we have validated our first line item. Let's try and validate the next line item. We all know that in Excel you can drag the formulas. So let's try and drag the formula here. Vertically, of course. That didn't quite work. This is one thing that you will observe. If you ever try and create a formula outside the pivot, so for example, the formula here is outside the pivot, right? This is where your pivot is. This is your entire pivot. This formula is outside the pivot. However, you are trying to use the values shown within the pivot. The challenge that you will have in such a case is, remember that these fields are all frozen. The cell references are frozen. As a result, even when you drag, it will not drag the formula down the way you expect it to be. So how do we fix this? So this is again an important trick for you to know. Remember that when dealing with pivots, if you're ever trying to use a formula in a cell external to the section of the pivot, and you want to use values from within the pivot table, always use the cell references directly, right? Do not click on that cell to bring the reference. So how do we use the cell reference? So type in equal to or a plus sign, either of them would work. And what's the first thing we need? We need the sale revenue. What's the sale revenue? Sale revenue is in cell number B4. As you can see, in this case, we typed in B4. We did not click on the cell. If you click on the cell and bring in the value, it will come with frozen ranges, and then the drag won't work. All right. And then we want to divide it by the number of days. Again, don't click on C4. If you click on C4, you'll have frozen ranges. Rather, we'll just type in C4. There we are. Hit enter. Okay. So we have the number here. And now this time when you try and drag, you will see you do get the exact same numbers as you have on the left-hand side under the calculated field that we hear, sum of sales per day, right? So this is how calculated field would work. This is a good demonstrative example. Let's move on to the next one, which is calculated item. All right, let's delete this one. Go back to our data set again, and let's select the data range and generate the pivot again. All right, yep, same range. Let's select new worksheet, no changes there. Now, in order to generate the calculated item, let's say the problem we are trying to solve is we want to look at revenue by month. So how do we look at revenue by month? So month goes to rows. When you take month to rows, all distinct item values from month are shown here. So you have months all the way from Jan till September on your data sheet. That's why you have these values. Now, if you pick and choose sales revenue, place it here. You know by now you'll get the sum of sales revenue by default. There we are. Now, let's say the problem we are trying to solve is, instead of looking at it by month, we want to look at it by quarter instead. What do we mean by that? So what we mean by that is Jan, Feb, and March would constitute quarter one. April, May, June would constitute quarter two. Let's select a different color. And July, August, and September would constitute quarter three. And this is how we want to see the data. So basically, we want them clubbed in terms of quarters. So how would that work? One of the ways that we can accomplish that is by using the option for a calculated item. Let's see how that would work. So in order to do that, when you click on the pivot table, make sure if you just click on the pivot table, if you just were to click on the aggregating field, chances are under pivot table analyze, and you click here, you will not see calculated item. Do you see calculated item is grayed out here? The only option available to you is calculated field. In order to make that option available, make sure that when you click on the pivot, click on the fields that you want to apply the calculated item to. So we want to apply calculated item to the months. So click here, go back to pivot table, analyze, field item, and there you have the calculated item available. So let's say the first calculated item we want is quarter one. What is quarter one supposed to constitute of? Quarter one is supposed to constitute of Jan, Feb, and March, right? If you click on add, quarter one is now added. Click on OK. There, as you can see at the bottom of the pivot table, quarter one has appeared. This quarter one is nothing but it's going to be the sum of these three values. If you were to add up these three values, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, it says 284K. That's what you have here as well. So quarter one is now added. Similar to this, let's say we want to add quarter two and quarter three as well. So we can go back to calculated item. You can select quarter two and select the right months for quarter two, which would then again be April, May, and June. All right, so that brings us to quarter two. That's added. So now quarter two will show up as well on the pivot table. And finally, let's add quarter three. So in order to add quarter three, you can again go to calculated item. You could type in quarter three. And once you've typed in quarter three, you can go ahead and select the next quarter, which is going to be July, August, and September. All right, there we are. So now we have all the three quarters created. So these three fields that you see here are the calculated items, right? Now what we can do is, if you just want to limit yourself to looking at the view by quarters, you can always do that. You can deselect the months here, and then you'll be left with the quarter. Okay, if I just copy this pivot table here, place it here, just for representation, and then let's go ahead and on this one, let's just select the months. So we just selected the months. Let's deselect the quarters, and now if you see, you'll see the same revenue shows here, right? So both these, so this is again one of the examples of how pivot tables are extremely useful. You're now looking at two different representations of the same thing, one by quarter and the other one by the month. So this is how you can use calculated items in order to represent or summarize and aggregate your data in a useful way. The next thing that we wanted to look at is expanding data from pivot table. So what this means is, if you have generated a pivot table and now if you want to look at the expanded version of that, how would you do that? So let's go back to sheet 4 and let's take an example of this. So let's say our pivot table is a two-dimensional view. Left side we have the month, And let's say on columns, we have the state. So this is a two-dimensional view of the pivot table. Each cell represents the intersection of a month and a state, right? So for instance, for Alaska, for the month of April, the sales revenue is $9,000. That's the way to interpret this. Now, let's say we wanted to look at these individual line items, the individual line items for these $9,000. How did these $9,000 in sales revenue come about? So if you double click on this, it will expand on a new sheet. As you can see here from sheet 4, we were on sheet 4. Now we are on sheet 6. It has expanded data for us. And this is how you get to see the raw data or the actual line items, which were aggregated to give you that view. All right. So it's a pretty simple thing. It's very useful. Just click on the pivot table item that you're trying to expand, and it will expand onto a new sheet and show you what was the raw data from which this data field, this data item came about. All right. So that's how you can look at this. Finally, let's try and take a look at group functions. So in order to look at group functions, let's go ahead and create a new one. Let's just create a new data sheet, or rather a new pivot table from the same data sheet. So, all right. And let's create a new pivot. And yep, there we are. So let's say that we try and create a pivot by city and by sales revenue. Okay. As you can see that every city is listed in alphabetical order right here. Okay. Now, let's say hypothetically what we would want to do is group these together. So cities are to be grouped together. So if you right click on this section and you see an option called group, if you click on group, it says cannot group that selection, right? What does that mean? It means that here you have no natural way of grouping these cities together. An example of this where this would work pretty well is, for example, if you have dates instead of cities, you can group dates. When you group dates, you can group them as a week. You can group dates as a month. You can group dates as a quarter, even as a year, right? But so is that the end of it? We can't group it here? Well, not quite. You'll still be able to group things here. So for instance, let's say we would want to group the cities alphabetically. So if you were to go ahead and let's say if you select these first three cities on the list, right? And if you were to do a click on this and let's say click on group, there, as you can see now, what the pivot tool has done is it has very intuitively created these natural groups on its own, right? It didn't have a lot of instructions for us, so the group names are kind of different, but as you can see, it has still been successful. And what it has done is it's kind of grouped all cities beginning with the same letter in the same group. So this is an example of how groupings could essentially work within the Excel pivot. Now, with this, another very important thing that one has to bear in mind in regards to Excel pivots, and this is not an advanced feature by itself, but will sometimes come in very handy. When you're working with Excel pivots on an industrial scale, and you're likely to have extremely large data sheets. You could have 200 columns and potentially 60,000 rows or maybe 100,000 rows, and you have a large data set. It is sometimes feasible that your data is going to be quite in excess. And it's probably going to be so large that you're going to have issues with working on the data. You could have a frozen Excel sheet, or other challenges. So how do we deal with that? One of the things that you can always do with this is if you were to right click on the pivot and you see an option called pivot table options right there. If you click on that, within the pivot table options, you will see there is an option for data. If you see now, if you uncheck under the pivot table data option, if you uncheck the save data source with the file like this, what the pivot table will then do is that while it will show you the table, but in effect the data for that pivot table is not reserved separately, and that will enormously help reduce the file size for you. And if you ever want to bring it back, let's say if you want to bring back the data, all that you have to do is right click on it and hit refresh, and the data will be allocated separately. The reason this is so important is as you work on multiple different sheets and create quite a large number of pivots, every time you generate a pivot, the pivot table will reserve data for itself from your raw data set. So in other words, you will end up creating multiple copies of subsets of the same raw data set. So in those cases, you'll see very quickly your file size can exaggerate and increase a lot. And by using this option, you can somehow reduce the file size. The other option is you can use a combination of this as well as saving the file in an Excel binary format. That should also help you reduce the file size a bit. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. See you next time.